The portals are used by developers who work for bank customers, so it's not really about developer engagement. We mainly deal with SOAP APIs and EBIX XML. And the purpose for the banks is, as I said, not to do with developer engagement, but more to do with smoothing the onboarding process for customers and reducing their support costs. Okay?
Hi, I'm the same guy I was 30 minutes ago. But in case you weren't in the room, my name's Carlo. Longino. I work for a company called Whip. We do consulting and outreach help for companies with developer programs.
Thank you, Carlo. My name is Mike Staines. I work for a company called Fuse API. We, on a day-to-day basis, work with APIs. I'm specifically a user experience designer and what we call a technologist.
Hey, just in case you just joined, my name is Irakli. I work for AP Academy.
All right. What I like about this panel is we have quite a different set of perspectives here, from UX to partner-based APIs, developer programs, and Mr. Microservices, Irakli. So the first question I want to throw out to you, and anyone can answer this. Let's say that I'm starting an API program. I work in a bank. We have APIs, but I've been given the task of starting an API program, whatever that means. Okay. What is the first thing I need to do? The very first thing.
Figure out what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And I don't mean that from we're supposed to be having an API program, but what are the things that you're actually trying to accomplish within your organization? Without that.
So is that before money? First I figure out why I'm being asked, or do I have to think about organization and
I think all of those things flow from the goals of what it is that you're trying to achieve. Without understanding what it is that you want to do, I think it's very difficult to understand how you need to organize, the budget that you'll need, the resources that you'll need internally.
Okay.
There's so many different things that you can do within the scope of an API program that you know, it's essentially, I don't want to say it's meaningless, but it's not helpful. It's so broad, it's unhelpful.
It looks like Trisha has something.
And I would just comment that I think you need to understand whether you're trying to develop open APIs and build up developer engagement, whether you want to try and improve efficiencies within your organization, so you're trying to develop internal APIs, or whether you want to improve your partner engagement process, so the APIs that you need to develop with partners or customers.
So those are two different.
I think all three are very different: internal, partner / customer, and open APIs where you're trying to engage developers and innovate. I would categorize. I mean, one of the reasons for doing those open APIs is for innovation purposes, I think.
Okay, so
I think you need to understand what you're trying to do.
So it's the why, right?
Yeah.
Why am I? Okay. So you mentioned open APIs. So Mike, you actually have the task of, you come into a company that has APIs, and they say, build us this experience. Do those sound like the right answers? Is knowing why the thing that you care about when you're looking from the outside?
So to actually work with developers, to attract developers, to build a developer economy, I think there's quite a few different things that we need to look at. The user experience and the accessibility of developer portals, for example. What kind of information and documentation are we actually putting together? Is it strong enough to actually attract the kind of developers that we want to attract? If we're looking at, say, I guess, partner engagement or specific partner engagement, how are we going to go about that? And actually providing something which is as thorough and as well thought out as you possibly can to engage the developer. The last thing you want to do, I guess, with an open API that's facing a developer community is to not give them the to use a term from earlier, a sandbox or a playground that is really well thought out. But yeah, certainly.
Okay. Does it align with everything? Are we speaking the same language? Yeah. So inside, figure out why. From the outside, make it usable. But Irakli, where does microservices fit in then with this storyline? Or does it? Does it break the storyline?
Which storyline?
This beautiful storyline of the API programmer book.
Yeah. So I agree with asking the question why, but I think in my experience, the important thing to figure out is who you ask the question why. Usually the person that comes to you and says we need an API program is not the person I would ask why.
Right.
In my experience, I've had a very interesting career. In my experience, usually people who come to me, they come to me because they had drinks with somebody, right? So my CEO had drinks, not current CEO, past companies. They had drinks somebody inspired them maybe with a competitor, and they said, we have an API, so they come to me and say, oh, we need an API because they have an API, right? So I'm not going to ask that person why. I need to understand who we're building this for, or who would be the first user of that API. Then I'm going to go and ask them why. So that's kind of my experience.
And is there a relationship between that and the boundaries you talked about before?
Microservices is really the implementation architecture design, like that's how you implement the complex system. It may or may not be the actual public interface of your APIs, right? You may or may not expose that. Like the end users ideally should not know whether you implemented your thing with microservices or something else. Like there's no direct correlation between just because I implemented my complex system with microservices, anybody in the world needs to know about it. As far as it's up and works.
Well, let's test that. Mike, do you care about microservices?
To a certain extent, I know exactly what they are and how to use them, but as to whether or not they need the level of definition that you're talking about, potentially not. On a day-to-day basis, we will dip into a specific point within an API and take a specific function. And as to whether or not we semantically label it as a microservice is another question.
So we have the implementation details separate from, I guess, the interface. You have knowledge of that stuff, but it doesn't really affect you. Okay. I'm going to ask a few more questions, but I want to open it up in case anyone else has questions they're dying to ask. There's one way at the back, the furthest possible location.
You have to walk, man.
It would be great if someone up here could ask the next question.
Thanks. Excuse me. All right, so I think this question is mainly for Carlo, but don't restrict it if we have to. So if you look at a developer portal like code.google.com, there are numerous Google products there. Google Maps, Google Payments, Google Ad, all sorts of things. And if you can imagine the chaos that must lie behind that of trying to corral hundreds of Google teams doing their 20% projects in many different locations, but still come up with a unified view. If you're a developer and you want to use Google APIs, you go to code.google.com. So that's a really impressive achievement that a company can pull together a coherent view across so many different products in one portal. So I just wondered from the panel, and maybe Carlo in particular, what are the dynamics in a company that enable that kind of successful result to happen? What pulls all those disparate geographical product teams in the same direction so that the company presents a coherent branded view of so many disparate activities? What pulls that together?
Or do you mean from an organizational perspective, or just whatever?
Well, there's probably many things you could say. I'm just interested to know from your experience, what commonalities from companies that you've seen, that not just Google but other companies, what are the successful things that those companies put in place to give that kind of successful result?
So it sounds like you're asking, what does it take to create that kind of culture, right? This is a culture question. So how do you create an API platform-centric culture?
And that's an interesting question, because I think if you look at something like the Google site, you mentioned code.google.com, not only do they have a lot of different products, developer tools and resources, each of those resources may appeal to a very different kind of developer working on a different kind of project, working in different languages and things like that. So being able to apply that sort of consistency across those different audiences is very challenging. But I think as Ronnie mentioned, it's an ingrained cultural choice. I think it takes strong leadership from the top that gets bought into throughout the organization of, regardless of the language or the type of developer or the application, this is our approach. This is what we do, and this is how we treat developers and how we deal with it. I think Google is a good example, of a developer-first approach. A lot of the times, the issues that we see are, if you look at someone like, say, Twilio, this is the core of what they do. So you would expect them to get it right. The messes that we tend to see are from companies where the developer part of things came later. And people are, well, how about if I talk about telco operators? I think they're probably the worst example of this, because a lot of that, what it was basically these companies trying to force developers to fit their business and to fit their way of doing things. And that's not really the approach that you can take. You really have to have that developer first mindset and say, okay, we need to make our business fit how developers work, because there's so many other providers of competing resources and similar type of things that if you're not doing it well, it's far too easy for developers to go somewhere else.
Follow on the telco example, actually, because I think it's instructive. I think that the telcos have for a long time been trying to expose APIs, and they have had this open innovation sort of a strategy. They call it the long tail, trying to get developers involved. And I think by and large they regard it as having failed. And you hear an awful lot of the telcos talking about their API program as to do with trying to improve internal efficiencies rather than engage developers. So I think it is reflective of the type of Google clearly wants to engage developers. Telcos try to do it as an add-on. So I agree.
Yeah, I think there has to be a point there about developer incentivization and actually how you actually work directly with a developer, person to person, on a very an intimate level, to actually implicitly support what they're doing. I know that from working agency side that it's very much a condition now where the developer has power. We're finding that the developer themselves is very much the storyteller and very much the person that's setting the agenda, rather than the traditional marketer or head of whatever department it might be.
Yeah, so my experience with that, I don't know what Google does. I have no insight in that, but I can give you an example, which is my favorite example from the banking industry, which is Capital One. I think they're doing also an amazing job with something like that. And the way that they were able to do it is by really rethinking what API governance means in the organization, right? So from the SOA web services, more internal facing stuff, we had a very specific understanding of API governance. It's basically the central point when we say this is good, this is bad, like architectural committee, stuff like that. And in the API space, they really rethought that. They said, we do have a centralized API management team, right? Like director of API management, et cetera, et cetera. But their job is not to green light or red light initiatives. Their job is to create facilities to allow many teams in an organization to run consistently, efficiently, and not look like they are all doing their own thing, right? So they actually build a set of tools where everybody knows where they need to go, where they need to publish API. They have the same structure for publishing APIs. And a number of organizations that did that then actually open sourced what they did. So now they have a benefit of other companies will use what they have open source and will contribute to it. It will become even better. So like facilitating those processes and showing the best way rather than having more like a carrot approach than a stick approach is what I have seen work in organizations that do it right.
Very good. One more question in the back here.
Hi, so my question is about microservices and sort of the internal architecture. Do you have any...
Does not mean that I have to answer the question, just so we're clear.
There's going to be a lot of people here who have, they look after systems, they work with systems that are very large, very complex, maybe made up of a number of packages and off-the-shelf things. And I struggle to see how you can break down something that complex and sort of pre-existing and do all the things around data decentralization that you were talking about. So I guess my question is, do you have examples, either in the financial industry or other industries, where people have successfully tackled that challenge, and any advice to doing that? Or is it very much something that people look at for sort of new applications where they have a greenfield and they say, hey, I'm Netflix and I'm going to do this, or I'm Spotify?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So the way I understand the question is, microservices sounds like a cool toy for the startups and people who are building greenfield, but what do you do if you're an actual mature organization that has a lot of legacy systems? I work with a lot of those kind of organizations, right? So I get a lot of questions and I see how it's getting done. What I have seen so far, being the success approach, right, there may be others, is people taking step by step, right? Don't just show up at work and say, okay, microservices is the new future, so we're going to just scrap it all and rework everything into microservices. But just like we did with mainframes, right, when we moved from mainframes into more API-based things, take it piece by piece, right? Chop off like this small part, maybe a core part of what your legacy system does, and redesign it as a microservice. And initially, guess what? That microservice may be actually calling into the legacy system to get some of the functionality, and then gradually just replacing it and cleaning up, right? I don't think it's really that different from the approaches we use for technical data elimination and other migrations we have done. But the important piece is that eventually, as the goal, is that whatever parts migrate to the new architecture should be reasonably clean and reasonably compliant to what you're trying to achieve, right? What is unfortunate is, and what I would say is the wrong way of doing it, I've also seen a number of organizations just Dockerize their completely not re-architected applications and say, okay, we are in a container, so we must be microservices, right? So there has to go a reasonable amount of architecture and has to be some gradual migration, but it's doable. Like, it's not something I can tell you in a sentence how to do it, but basically that's the approach. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. That's
Thanks.
Useful. Thanks.
Good question. We're getting close to the end here, so I want to ask one last question that each of you can decide to answer. What this kind of touches on, this question, is the idea of transformation, right? Because we do spend a lot of time talking about the new technology companies. And we often don't spend enough time talking about how do we take existing companies and turn them into being able to do the new things. So from each of you, I'd love to hear, like, what do you think companies should either stop doing or start doing to take advantage of this new space?
I think, I guess, from my perspective, we see on a day-to-day basis quite a lot of corporates working with a mix of legacy APIs, new third-party APIs, and competently putting them together to actually create a new organic thing. In terms of what they should stop and start doing, there's quite a lot of the time there's no right or wrong way from a developer's perspective actually how to do these things. From a personal perspective, documentation,
yeah,
always, and the ability to contribute, and the ability to actually, and I sound like I'm actually standing on a soapbox, but for the developer to actually be heard and to be given the feedback that they need. We are trying to build important tools that influence day-to-day life, so we need that feedback.
Carlo, what about you?
I think that one of the biggest organizational things is, a combination of some of the technical and business-focused aspects, but really looking at how these organizations view risk and how they perceive risk, because I think sometimes they get things a little backwards. Right. I think oftentimes existing organizations look at the risk is inherent in doing something. implement these new systems, these new technologies, that is risky. But I think that in a number of different industries, I'm not an expert on banking, maybe this is the case, maybe not. We mentioned telcos earlier. I've been at an event for telcos the last couple of days, and I think certainly there, the risk for them is to not do anything. It's riskier for them to say, oh, things are good, we're making our billions, charging you 10 cents for an SMS, it's all good, we don't need to do anything. The bigger risk to those guys is not being prepared for the oncoming transformation and the disruption that simply is inevitable. And so really it's their quote-unquote aversion to risk that is actually very risky.
So fighting their natural sense of satisfaction, right?
I think it's a little deeper than that. Just not being happy to accept, a traditional viewpoint of risk and really understanding, the dynamics of the industry and the world.
Okay, very good. Tricia, what are you saying?
So I'm going to answer the question in terms of PSD2 and XS2A. That coming down the tracks, banks have to open up their APIs. Or open up bank account information through APIs. So you have to work on some sort of APIs. And if it were me, I would start by talking to some corporate customers about what sort of services you can provide to the customers using those new APIs and get started.
Right. Easy enough. Irakli?
So I think it's fair to say that currently the de facto guidance on that is the bimodal IT guidance, right? So you have to have this balance of the running the business and innovating. And I have a love-hate relationship with bimodal, right? I have a love relationship with it because I think it's a very solid concept that really gets to the heart of what you need to be doing to, actually run the business and not sink it because you're doing too many risks, but also not be afraid of taking risks because then somebody will eat your lunch. But the way it's often implemented is very unfortunate, what I have seen, right? So often what people do is they let the legacy teams be this old school, like just keep doing what you have been doing, and they create the new teams completely separate, like now you be the innovator. And all that does is create this huge anonymity between the teams, right? The old legacy maintenance teams start saying like, I didn't know what they were doing, there's some new people, I don't necessarily need to know what they are doing, but I clearly don't like them, right? Because this is something I don't understand. And the new teams get to basically whine about the old teams and how they never just learn the new things. So I think if you really are serious about this, right, in a big enterprise, you have to start by culture change. The people who know the best your legacy systems, the people who are the lights are still on kind of people will have to be pushed in some cases to make sure that they are the ones that are also taking the risks, right? They are part of it. You cannot create the segregations of we have this cool hipster kids and everybody else in the organization. That's what I have seen being the most damaging.
All right. So there's some real cultural transformation that might need to happen before the technical transformation.
Necessarily be the service or the application. And I think that's something that a lot of people get wrapped up in. The API is just the mechanism, really. And so I think keeping that sort of mindset can be helpful. And like I said, I think there's a situation where both make sense, both of those approaches. But just thinking about some of these locked up business problems that we have and how we can solve those, and then the innovation can derive from those, even if they are fairly prescriptive. I mean, I think if you look at people whose business role is to come up with new products and services, they probably have a very different perspective on this than someone whose job it is to stand up and create the APIs. So I think having those conversations is the best way to fish that out, rather than relying on the API designer, the API architect, to know exactly where that line is in their organization.
And there was a question about extendability too, and evolvability. How do you're right, we didn't address that very much this afternoon, but what are some strategies for helping with change? It's for anyone on the panel.
I guess in terms of extendability, and growth of the API, find out, I guess, how many different ways in which we can actually capture the feedback and usage. How are we measuring? What metrics and analytics we're actually using to measure the efficiency of the API itself and the functions within it, and obviously looking at iterative control and how we actually release different versions, and perhaps looking at a roadmap that goes beyond 3 years, maybe 5 years, 10 years, and how we work with it beyond that. Obviously, if we're looking at successful ongoing partnerships and integrations and uses of the API itself, how can we actually keep the developer economy and the developer community actually incentivized to use the APIs ongoing and integrate it in something that is going to last for that amount of time?
So Mike, when you're building mobile apps, do you have any minimum requirements where you say, well, I'm not going to build on top of this because it's so brittle, I'll have to change my app after 3 weeks or 1 month?
Yeah, I think there's an expected level of quality within the API and what it does. I think a lot of the time when you're addressing how an API is actually dressed up and presented to you as a developer, you're going to need to really have as much of a sandbox as you possibly can get, and as much of a, I guess, use cases, exemplary material, and various different pieces of valuable content that, as a developer, we can see how it's been used in the past. And fundamentally, it has to be attractive in lots of different ways.
Okay. And Irakli, I want to give you a chance to address this. I know you probably have 1 or 2 thoughts on extendability, right? Maybe 1.
I have 3 days worth of a conference of thoughts about this, and there are some technical solutions to this. Few of you who may know me from the past know I'm a huge fan of specific design style in APIs called hypermedia style, which I believe can solve a lot of problems of extensibility and evolvability. But there are also some non-technical solutions to this, right? You mentioned lean product management and MVPing your product and not assuming that you know more than you actually know, and not assuming that you really... I think one of the biggest mistakes I've seen is API programs start up and people assume that they need to solve all the problems in the world, including the world peace and cancer and all this stuff, right? You really don't. Start by solving a very small, tangible problem through the APIs and show that you can do a good job, and then maybe become the head of the UN or something like that.
So Tricia, I want to let you give us one last piece of advice to end the panel.
Well, I might as well just answer this one.
Right.
As well. So I just think that there's no simple answer. And you have to follow the strategies that banks, for example, have been following for many years, which is to issue timelines when versions change, to give plenty of time for testing, to provide good documentation, and we don't know the future.
Right. Okay. Excellent.